The Jetsons Charlton, Issue 5. Jane tells her kids to be on their best behavior because George is bringing a rare friend from work home. As in this universe, he does have friends at work, to the point where someone talks like he has them all the time. But then Judy ends up thinking his friend Homer is good looking and calls him smart for being a bookkeeper. It goes straight to his head. He dares them to find a card and Astro finds it, so he thinks he didn't do it well when he shouldn't be that surprised that it happened when it was on the table, so there's a 1/3 chance of him guessing right. So after the dog does something human again with no explanation, Homer leaves with George being mad that he didn't balance his books. When he visits his house again, he dresses differently to impress her when he should have known she liked him for how he was before. And somehow he's dumb enough to call her out of style in 2 Square. He leaves. Jane tells Judy that someone I've never heard of is on his way over with some clothes he wants her to see. And she's impressed as the story ends. I guess he's from her school. That's it? What a short story. Why did he try to impress his co-worker's teenage daughter? Then Jane tells George that Rosie goes on strike. He uses a wrench on her without any resistance for some reason, because I guess she's programmed to let people repair her. And ends with him getting a coin out of her and saying that the reason she wants to do housework was that she wants to be a slot machine. So it was just a pointless comedy page. Or I guess he was making a joke. That's good, because it'd be annoying to have a whole story about her striking. In the next story, it wastes some time with Elroy playing doctor with George when he's napping from work exhaustion. It's too bad Sum, who's in Elroy's bag from social anxiety, has to whisper to Elroy to get him to give George smart advice. He should have known this advice already because he's a genius in the show. He tells George that if he replaced the lighting units over his desk in his office, he'd see better and wouldn't get as tired because he wouldn't be squinting and bending lower to read the paper. Then some text tells us that thanks to his friend, he diagnosed a faulty control panel in Rosie, notices that Judy's backache is from tight shoes, and gives Jane a 3-day vacation idea. He gets complimented for something Sum did, and surprisingly he does show him to people and admit that he's the one who tells him what's wrong with people. I guess his severe social anxiety is why he's just whispering in Elroy's ear. Apparently he only wants to hide from George. Elroy gets given some more advice to give someone. Sum gets offered a job, and then it turns out he doesn't want the job because he'd rather play with Elroy at his age. In the next story, there's a cliche of the series as Rosie is busted again. She falls over and somehow George accuses her of faking it, as if she has a history of trying to get out of doing the dishes. She tells Judy to call the repairman, and because George has a stethoscope and a kit, Jane immediately assumes he'll kill her. At least I thought that, because he's tried to fire her for malfunctioning too much before. Instead he's going to be out of character. He says he wants to save money on repair bills. He can fix a Food-O-Matic and a car half the time. Even him at his most competent isn't always successful, so he definitely shouldn't bother with this. To be fair, robots are different from Food-O-Matics and igloo making machines, so I assume Rosie was too complicated for him to fix. She goes through a wall, and the story ends with a predictable revelation that George only made the repair bill go up. There's no way he'd have done this, and there's no way she'd appreciate that he tried to help when he totally failed. In the next story, George reminds Jane that she thinks he's terrible with money and should be supervised anytime he buys something. He gives her a diamond ring. Rosie has absolutely no reason whatsoever to examine the diamond with a microscope from her eye. That she has no excuse for having. She's their maid and chef. This isn't in her job description. She should realize what a bad idea it is to do nothing but upset both her boss and his wife with information she doesn't need to know. She says it's the bottom of a ginger ale bottle. He takes it away, and it breaks. The story ends with her at least vacuuming it up, and at least Jane's still smiling at the end. She shouldn't be telling George not to complain about Rosie though, because he has every right to at a time like this. It's delusional of her to think Rosie is like a sister to someone who does nothing but give her bigoted insults. I'm proud of Jane for not getting mad at George, when if this was Veronica she'd have reacted with violence. She's never really violent with him, but she has gotten overly harsh with him, and now she's being uncharacteristically patient with him. I wish the story ended with Rosie being called out for ruining a sweet moment and not minding her own business. I value the truth too, but there's a time and place for everything. And then there's a pinup where Rosie can look at the Earth from a magic telescope on the terraformed moon, and all she does is tell Jane that George forgot to close the windows, which is going to get them ruined with rainwater, which would only go into the house if there was a windstorm. The only way you're being able to see that well, even through a telescope, makes sense is if she was upgraded to have better vision by someone, like Elroy. It'd have to be him, because she costs George too much on repairs as it is, and he doesn't like her. In the next story, somehow George doubts the existence of a smoke creature Elroy talks about making with his chemistry set, even though he lives in a crazy future where he doesn't think to question the presence of his alien friend at all. Obviously the smoke monster is solid in his fist because it can hit George. Some says the formula Elroy used lacked an essential ingredient, so the monster vanishes. That must be a special magic potion scent. I really hate that George doesn't believe Jane about what happened to him. Thankfully, it is explained that some brought the chemistry set from Mars. I really hate that George is written to accuse Jane of pretending to believe that Sum's a real Martian, and that he somehow thinks Elroy would have been allowed to buy him at the toy store. It's insanely bigoted of him. George sees aliens all the time. George has no excuse for putting stuff in Elroy's chemistry set. I say this because he's so accident-prone that you'd think he'd catch on and stop having the confidence to take risks. Okay, at least he read the chemistry book, and he did used to be good at chemistry. But if he read the book and he's good at chemistry, there's no reason he'd fail the experiment. Elroy tells him to run from a two-headed smoke monster that hits George, without us seeing the impact. Elroy sends Salt at it, and he has no excuse to assume that George doesn't remember this. At least he wisens up and gives up on the chemistry set. The Jetsons, Charlton, Issue 6. You'd think when Jane said in front of George he didn't forget after all, he'd realize she means that it's his anniversary. George reminds her of someone who went to school with them. He gets offended at his name being misremembered as the name of a loser and storms off. Jane says it's her birthday, which is more imaginative. He tries to go shopping but doesn't have his credit card because he left it under the anti-gravity cushion at his office. So this is a whole story about him having a flaw he almost never has. That sucks. Why not invent a new character? He deludes himself somehow into thinking that he can make her stop insulting him about something. It's confusing that the firemen spraying his work table are wearing blue like the cops. The fire started because George forgot to turn a switch. He's told off for leaving the office and says he forgot it was so early when he did. Then a cop drives Elroy over to him because he found him crying at the air terminal after George forgot to pick him up, since he forgot he was due back from Astro Camp. He can't sleep, so he takes a walk, and when someone says it's about time he got here, he makes me wonder why he knows his last name, because he calls him a sucker. Obviously George would run away from him or insult him and walk off because of that. He offers to give him a better memory, and uses a machine claiming that it can give him the memory of an elephant. He remembers the date of the first moon landing. Then George reminds him that he owes him money with interest too. So it turns out he actually did give him better memory. Then he'd only call him a sucker because he'd think there'd be a risk to his health if he used the machine on him. I thought he would get him to pay him for a machine that wouldn't work. So Joe says he created a monster, and the writer tries to prove him right because George hits Judy off screen for being disobedient 4 years ago. I wish he said what she was being punished for. It's weird that he says he remembers Jane when Jane is behind him, and then he says Judy when Judy's in front of him. Later he brings Jane a gift because 10 years ago they danced for the first time. Because of a coincidence that could have easily not happened, Jane's aunt is here who hates dancing, which caused it to be bad that he remembered this, because the writer is jealous of his memory and wants to contrive reasons for him to regret it, when realistically, Most of the time, George would benefit from it. Sure, it's a shame that Jane didn't warn him that her aunt was visiting so that he would remember she'd show up and not make this mistake. I guess she visited really impromptu, so she couldn't have warned him. There's no reason he'd bring up that she lost her husband. But she's an awful person who plans to have Jane deleted from her will when it was George who annoyed her. Because she already hates Jane. So she deserves it. Why did she even visit if she could turn on Jane that easily? So George decides to leave the house, get away from her for a while. And Joe puts a net over him and says there's been chaos since he gave him a good memory. How would he ever know that? There's no reason the elephant would have forgotten he's an elephant and chase a cat. So George gets his bad memory back, and the story ends with him looking ridiculous by having tags tied to each of his fingers. He should have the tags in his pocket so they wouldn't embarrass him. In the next story, George can't wait to help a pretty woman because of her good looks. The title's intriguing, and the woman's green skin makes it look like she's an alien. I wonder if she'll be a villain. He knows what she's saying because apparently he knows alien languages, but still doesn't believe some's a Martian. He gives her a car key and offers her hundreds of dollars, and I wonder if the title means she's brainwashing him. He comes home and Jane actually recognizes Venetian perfume on him. But she doesn't realize that he was just brainwashed, apparently. This scene had me skimming it because it was too hard to watch. She slams the door on him, and Rosie has a rare moment of decency with him where she tells him she'll fix him up some coffee and let him talk about it. She dials the police so that I could hear his story, and reveals that he's got Venus de Milo in jail for doing this a lot, and Rosie must have already known about Venus de Milo because otherwise she wouldn't have called to the police. But how did she ever get put in jail successfully if she's able to hypnotize people? I have to assume she's only able to hypnotize people who are attracted to women, so she only got arrested successfully because she tried it on a cop that isn't. Too bad a 70s comic can't explain that, so she got put away off screen. It's so underwhelming. Why have the plot then if I won't see how she got foiled? Come to think of it, you could have had Judy disguise herself as a man, pretend to be hypnotized by her, and record the whole thing because of a tape under her shirt. And that could have gotten her arrested. Instead, the story ends with Jane still being mad at him because he only stopped for her because she was pretty, implying that he wanted to cheat on her. She's justified in being mad since he was acting shocking, but she's not a good wife anyways. I don't blame him for wanting someone else, as someone can't choose whether he's attracted to a person or not. Since she's never on his wavelength, of course he would want someone else. In the next story, Rosie doesn't notice she's dumping gravy on George from daydreaming about a robot. And she's been clumsy ever since she fell for him. All because somehow people gave their robots minds based on humans without programming in restraints like not letting them get crushes that make them less useful. Because I guess they need a way to get more robots without the robot factory that badly because there's a robot shortage. Why even have a robot if they're gonna have the same problems as humans? He naturally calls her out on being an uncharacteristically bad employee, and Jane tells Rosie he didn't mean his threat and claps her hands over his mouth, threatening him to either nod his head in agreement or live on one meal for the rest of his life. Carrying out that threat would obviously be abusive, which of course isn't justified no matter what, and I'm sure he could get different meals himself anyways. His family tries to pressure him into stopping her from trying to leave, since they're too dependent on someone they only hired recently. He still wants her out of the house, and now he says she's the catcher on his baseball team. Which makes no sense. How'd she be allowed? Why would her quitting keep her from batting on a kid's baseball team? Why would he think she would stop? And someone just assumes her crush is true love because of the stereotype of girls being hopeless romantics. Rosie refuses to listen to George and tries to leave regardless. Rosie can act out literally as badly as she'd want without hurting them on purpose, and her totally dependent family would bully George into not firing her. I'm pretty sure families aren't hopelessly dependent on maids in real life. Jane, who's been reminding me of Wilma, threatens to leave George. Oh wait, she's trying to kick George out of his own home. You'd think the writer would know George is in the right when he has him say, "I shouldn't have gotten irritated just because you poured hot gravy in my head. Why should I get mad over a little thing like that?" I have to assume it's just trying to be funny, but that is not good writing to get you steaming with his family. They're a perfectly likable saccharine family in the 60s comic. Here the writers are just bitter, hating the whole concept of marriage. Rosie thankfully isn't written to agree to George's bribes because he shouldn't have to reward her. She gets a call that Judy alerts her to, which is from Mike. Jane's instantly smiling and knows she accepted his apology before she's even acknowledged it in the first place. It makes her look bipolar that she's able to instantly snap from one mood to the next. Just make sure you never say anything again that might upset her. Totally reasonable. I think it's the family's problem they're so dependent on this untrustworthy maid. She gets asked by Mike if he could have dinner at her house. I don't blame George for being mad at him. She does have some nerve. After she just poured hot gravy on his head, which I'm sure would hurt. Most people would say maids have no business having a date in their boss's home, so there's no way Mike would have asked her for one. She only agrees because she knows she can get away with murder in this place. She'd know George would mind. I don't know who Mike is, so why should I like him and care? Jane puts George in charge of the dishes and tidying up, as if he needs to make up for saying something overly harsh to someone who poured hot gravy on his head, and was constantly being clumsy earlier in her place of work in his home, because she's too lazy to do what she's supposed to be doing at least half of the time, if not Rosie. Then she has the nerve to expect George's car key so that she could borrow his car, because God forbid Mike use his own. When I doubt he would be without a car. How did he even get here without a car? Did his car break down after stopping here? I wish that was explained. The story ends with George biting the table in anger with the TV somehow damaged by him, as I think that man needs a divorce. I think losing half his stuff would be absolutely nothing compared to all the avoided stress of being rid of her. Because it doesn't look like there's any sort of stuff of his that he's overly sentimental about. And I think the only things he's sentimental about would be stuff that Jane doesn't think is worthwhile, like an old sweater. In the next story, suddenly George is smart enough to make a discovery with Elroy's chemistry set and say nobody should know it, when all of his smarts are supposed to be in technology, so I guess this is a different universe. He tries to hide the formula, even though he knows just looking at it would tell Rosie nothing. Elroy tells some that his dad discovered a secret formula, and all of his family tells a friend about it as well. After some panels of utter darkness, some people are revealed under a light who want to discuss George's formula, which they want to learn about. George hides in the closet, not trusting his own family. Jane gives him a logical fallacy argument in favor of it. She isn't related to him. He has no reason to say he doesn't trust Rosie. This happened just to prove him right. She dumps food on him, which I doubt a real maid would do to her boss, and literally talks like a domestic abuser by saying that he made her do it, when she still made the choice. At least she offers to get a towel, but then she doesn't and goes back to washing dishes because he somehow tells her not to bother. Then one of the bad guys comes into the house with a kit with no explanation for how he got in so easily. He tells her that her 1,000-mile checkup is due and gets her to turn around by just telling her to, even though she was suspicious. He inserts a different programming tape to make her spy on George and decide to take his papers. Jane conveniently sees this and warns George. If she was this useful way more often, I'd be able to forgive her instead of getting increasingly more frustrated with her. She tells him she took the bus, and somehow Rosie punches the guy and says that she pretended to spy for them. Which is confusing because they thought it would work, and that must have been for a reason. I really wish it was actually explained properly why the tape switching didn't brainwash her. That's a deus ex machina. I have to assume that some cast a spell on her so that this would be the case, just in case. He thanks her, and he should have known better than to ask a manipulative, selfish abuser how he could ever make it up to her for distrusting her. Go figure. After all of the times she tried to leave the family. The story ends with him saying that he never thought she'd make him do the dishes for a whole week. Too bad if he tried to break his word, his family would bully him. Because as her boss, he has every legal right to not do this. The fact that she expected him to do this just proved he wasn't so wrong about distrusting her, even if she would have never read or given away secret papers. It's really lame that we never find out what his secret formula was for, and he doesn't ever get rich off it, because the writer was lazy and didn't have priorities. It's a miracle he even invented it in a comic where he can't fix things. And I wish the comic had more continuity for once so I could trust it to keep him being talented. The first story is about Judy falling for George's bookkeeper friend, which doesn't make him uncomfortable in spite of the age difference, which is a little creepy, but we're not supposed to sympathize with him because her praise goes straight to his head and he grabs the idiot ball at the end. He didn't need to change clothes to impress her, and you'd think he wouldn't insult her when she could have easily not thought he was good looking. This would only make sense if he intentionally put her off because she's a teenager. The plot doesn't need any sci-fi in it, so it was pointless. The second story is about Sam being overpowered again in a third new way because he tells Elroy some great medical advice despite being a child. I wonder if the writers like him way too much, because they think they can write him to have literally any ability, when someone needed to tell them that him being an alien doesn't justify this. If I'm gonna see a story with him, I want him to be using witchcraft again, and it's already convenient that he can soup up a car. There's no way he'd also be a medical expert. But as forced as it was still a good story because I liked that Elroy and him were helping people the whole time. But if Sam wasn't an alien, which it could easily not be because that doesn't really explain his intelligence when not every alien is that smart. If Sam wasn't an alien, it'd just be a mundane plot not belonging in the series. And the third story is an idiot plot where George tries to fix Rosie, which he'd never do, so go figure he makes things worse. I wish the story reminded the audience that he knows how to fix stuff and explained that Rosie's just too complicated. Because I respect that about him making him better than just a Homer precursor. He fixed a shrinking machine in the show. The final story is Elroy make a smoke monster with Sam's chemistry set from Mars, which is solid enough to hit George twice. And the second time was after George made another one from overconfidently adding to a chemical when he had no business doing that. I would have cared that Elroy saved him with the creative method even. But the story got me too mad at George for being completely forced by the writer to not believe Sam's a Martian. I have to assume Sam doesn't care enough to show him his parents. Even though Elroy and Jane would appreciate him being made to stop talking like this. Because Sam doesn't care about anyone, ever. But the story was interesting. I just don't know how the writers have the goal to have Sam in more than one story in the issue. He's interesting, full of creative potential, but he's so overpowered and out of place that it's common sense to keep him to one story an issue. And even having him once an issue is ridiculous. The first story is a needlessly depressing plot about George being ridiculously forgetful when unexpected to believe he's always been like that. And then he gets a great memory from a mad scientist, just for the writer to make it backfire on him because of an unlikely coincidence. But he would have been caught in a net and forced to get back to normal anyways. I wish he did a lot more with the concept of his good memory backfiring on him. It could have been justified that he'd regret having it if his good memory made him focus more on the sheer amount of mistakes he's made and embarrassments he's been through. The second story is about George getting hypnotized into giving away his stuff, forcing me to assume that the woman who did it is a witch, just for the thief to be thrown in jail off screen without us getting to see it. And I have to assume it's because the writer wouldn't be allowed to so much as imply that she failed to hypnotize a guy because he didn't like girls. So it was underwhelming and felt like it just wasted my time tormenting George. Jane made it bad by being mad at him, when she should be more focused on pitying him for being the victim of a crime instead of just caring about her own jealousy. And the story should have been fantasy instead of sci-fi, because clearly being an alien from an inhospitable planet doesn't justify her power, when the title should have made it obvious to the writer that she should have been called a witch. The third story has George get hot gravy poured on his head because someone he pays to clean his house cared so little about doing a good job that she became clumsy from daydreaming about her crush all the time. So he can't blame him for getting harsh with her. But because the family has an unhealthy dependency on the maid, which isn't even explained verbally here, he's demonized when she tries to leave them. Why would she try to leave them just because only one person is fed up with her, when he clearly doesn't have any power in his family anyways? Because clearly she's been trying to emotionally manipulate him into letting her do whatever she wants. If Mike hadn't called, she would have accepted his offer. Can you imagine if a real maid acted like this? How could a robot act like this? It's frustrating being a mundane plot where you can't help but side with George even if his family does need Rosie now, because they're way too harsh on him and bully him into giving her an apology she doesn't deserve when she's the one causing all the drama. The final story is George miraculously invents a secret formula with the chemistry set. And because his family finds out and tells their friends, someone tries to get Rosie with a tape switch to steal George's papers and go to them. She knew how to get to them, but somehow retained the free will to hit them because the writer didn't know how to resolve the plot. It could have left it there, but instead she gets overly rewarded for just being loyal to her employer like she's supposed to be, when she would have had nothing to gain by betraying him. And she did betray him in this story. So I don't know why the writer has him stuck doing the dishes for a week when it's clearly disproportionate retribution against someone who, granted, shouldn't have thought she would steal his formula, but had every reason to hate someone abusive and not trust them. This issue sucks. It's a good thing most of the issues in this comic aren't bad.